Hey everybody, today is Monday, December 19th, 2022. Coming up on the show today, from the new film Babylon, editor Tom Cross.
In Whiplash, the challenge was how do you take band practice and make it feel like a war movie? In the case of Babylon, how do you take silence, the notion of a pin dropping, how do you amplify that to feel like life and death? You know, I might be cutting things silently, especially if it's action. I cut it silent to get the rhythm, just the pictorial rhythm, and then you put the music after. You know, Damien and I would often talk about just go for it. This might be the last chance we get to do something like this, ever. For better or worse, it's not a normal movie.
Yes, all that and much more in this edition of The Rough Cut. Okay, greetings, my friends. Welcome to the podcast. We talk all things post-production here on The Rough Cut, you know, TV and film. Today it's a film. We are going to be discussing Damien Chazelle's new film, Babylon. If you're one of those people that listens to the podcast right when it comes out, in other words, my favorite people, if you're one of those people, it's highly unlikely you have seen Babylon yet, because it comes out a few days after this podcast drops. But do not worry, no spoilers here. Just lots of interesting bits of info that I hope inspires you to get out and see Babylon. Speaking of inspiring, our guest today is Babylon editor Tom Cross. That name should sound quite familiar because if you care about movies at all, you know that Tom won an Oscar editing Damien Chazelle's big debut, Whiplash. And then Tom was nominated for an Oscar for Chazelle's next film, La La Land. And of course, we've had Tom on the podcast to talk about Damien Chazelle's First Man, and also on last year to talk about his work on the latest Bond entry, No Time to Die. So those are all kinds of good reasons to be familiar with Tom Cross. One more reason, a real good one, is that you're a faithful listener of The Rough Cut and noticed that on last week's episode with spirited editor Brad Wilhite, Brad mentioned reaching out to Tom for some advice on cutting musicals. And I think we just might follow up on that with Tom today. But let's get back to the topic of Babylon. I have to say, I've never seen a film quite like it. Tom's editing is, of course, fantastic. And it had to be, because Damien Chazelle gave him a film that is parts raucous, frenetic, poetic, and powerful. I don't know if it's for everyone and what film is, but if you're a movie fan and someone who appreciates great editing, you're going to want to see Babylon. Let me give you the top-level description of what the film is about. Babylon is a tale of outsized ambition and outrageous excess, tracing the rise and fall of multiple characters in Hollywood during an era of unbridled decadence and depravity. Now, as I said, it's not out yet. I think December 22nd is the first time it'll be available to movie-going audiences. But I can tell you that of the people I know that have seen it, we were all anxious to talk to each other about the film. It definitely stirs a reaction in you and stays with you into at least the next day after you see it. So after hearing me say all that, you can only come to the conclusion that it would take a very talented editor to tame that beast. And of course, Tom is indeed a talented editor, and one who is a delight to speak with about the art and craft of editing. So let's do that, right after a quick shout out to our friends and Rough Cut sponsor, Extreme Music. Now, anyone listening to this podcast is either already making or has the intent to make a TV show or movie. And when you do, of course, you want it to sound great. And the best way to do that is to go see Extreme Music. For 25 years, they've been the ones that smart storytellers have turned to for the very best in production audio. Music created by the biggest and best names in the business. Michael Giacchino, Hans Zimmer, Trent Reznor, Mark Mothersbaugh, Quincy Jones. I could go on, but I won't, because you get the idea. Now let me tell you how to get the music. All you got to do is go to extrememusic.com and search their enormous catalog of tunes for metadata like genre, tempo, instrumentation, lyrics, stuff like that. Something I think is even more fun is that you can just upload a track to Extreme Music, and they will use their ESP, that would be Extreme Sonic Perception, to find you ones like it. You can get your tracks in different links. You can get your tracks with different instruments. You can do it all right there on their website. Or if you need a little help with the licensing, you could talk to a real person at an office near you. So the next time you have a big movie or TV show to make, well, go make it. And make it with those musical geniuses at Extreme Music. Okay, time to break down Babylon. Our tour leader on this trip through Tinseltown is none other than Oscar-winning editor Tom Cross.
It's okay.
We need to do two interviews. Like, I need to do the one that we release and the one where...
There's a lot to unpack.
There's a lot to unpack. I can't recall being so overwhelmed by a film. I went to see it the other day, and I was talking to a friend who had seen it already, and that friend said, "You got to call me afterwards." And I said, well, I'm seeing it at 7 o'clock. It's a 3+ hour movie. It's too late. He's like, no, you promised me you'll call me afterwards.
Right.
And of course, we spoke about it. And then the next day, I was thinking about what I would ask you about the film. I got in my car to drive to work. And then 25 minutes later, I'm pulling into the parking lot at Ave, and I realized I never turned on the radio. I never stopped to get coffee. I might have run somebody over. I don't know. Like, I was so locked in on Babylon.
Yeah.
So this is my excuse ahead of time that this interview could go all over the place.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I saw the trailer when it first came out and thought, wow, this movie looks insane.
Yeah.
And then I saw the movie and realized the trailer was right. I'll just warn you now that I don't think this is going to be the normal interview.
No, and I guess for better or worse, it's not a normal movie. You know, Damien and I would often talk about just go for it. This might be the last chance we get to do something like this ever.
What was it he wanted to make? What was his goal with this film?
Very good question. I've heard him say that the movie's kind of a love letter to cinema, but a hate letter to Hollywood. And I think that he was fascinated by this idea of the Hollywood Dream Factory and how obviously it's idealized, and it's very easy for us to have a lot of fuzzy memories or visions of it. And certainly he played on that romance in La La Land. But I think he was also really interested in exploring kind of a dark side to it. There have been stories that have been told that do that in movies and stuff. I think he just wanted to unpack it for himself. And in doing that, trying to do that and wanting to do that, he wrote this big script and he did all this research. Something I really remember is like when we were finishing up First Man, he was already researching and I guess probably writing and reading a lot about the time period from the silent era to sound. And I remember him telling me about this book. We were on our way to, I think, the premiere of First Man at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in IMAX. And he told me about this book called, I think it's called The Speed of Sound, which was kind of a chronicle of the technology that changed cinema from the silent era to the sound era. And I started, when I got back to LA, I started reading the book, and it was fascinating. It was a bit humbling, actually, because the book would talk about all these silent movies that were huge smash hits starring the biggest stars of the day. And a lot of the people and a lot of the movies I hadn't heard of. And so it was very humbling to think that contrary to what we often talk about in terms of movies being immortal, which is certainly touched on in Babylon, I mean, this seemed to suggest that there will come a time where people will not know what this movie is or won't remember these actors. And there was something very humbling about, you know, working in this business, being lucky to work in it, but also understanding that people have come before, people will come after. You're just part of it in this parade that just continues, you know? The first thing he said to me is, I want to make this big ensemble picture, which is different from what we had done before, because, you know, Whiplash, La La Land, they're kind of two-handers. First Man is about this one guy. So he was like, I want to just go for this, create this world, show Hollywood in a certain way, and show it through the perspectives of several characters, you know? And I think he was thinking of movies like Robert Altman's Nashville, like how do you create a tapestry to help present this world? And so when he told me that, I knew that it was going to be really exciting, but it also sounded really daunting. And it sounded I was kind of afraid also. I had read that when Brad Pitt read the script, his response was, oh, this is great. This is amazing. What are you going to cut out? Yeah.
There's no way you're going to get all this in there. You know, when you read the script, did you have similar reaction, and what were the notes you had for Damien about that script?
You know, I really remember just reading it and taking it in and feeling like it was really deep and dense because the script is. I remember just getting to the end of it feeling like I had really taken a journey with all these characters. Like all the characters had their own character arcs, and some bigger than others, but they all went through these changes, and all these stories kind of intertwined. I mean, basically what the script reminded me of, and hopefully the movie kind of begins to achieve this idea. The script reminded me of this idea that people come to Hollywood and they come for the purposes of being transformed in some ways. They want to be transformed into something that's in their dreams and something that they fantasize about. But as the script kind of showed me, the story was about how transformation happens, but it's often dark and it's not what you think. And so I really had this feeling by the time I got to the end of the script of really feeling that transformation. The script is like 180 pages. And so I always knew that it was potentially going to be big, but Damien really reminded me and supported the original intention, which was like, yeah, this script is this length. We have to tell all these stories. It's going to be big. We are not going to be able to boil this down to like 100-minute movie. That's not what we're doing. And in fact, the first cut that Damien and I looked at that we ever saw, we actually did try to kind of crunch things, try to expedite. And the first cut we watched was 2 hours and 56 minutes. And it really didn't work. It was way too fast, way too abbreviated. We were missing story because we had tried to eliminate certain beats. You felt it, like it really didn't feel right. And so the next cut we had was like 3 hours and 30 minutes. And then that felt like that was a little like a bridge too far. So we kind of whittled it down. I don't know if the next one was 3:15 or 3:10. So we started out of the gate really trying to like just go for it, go real tight. And basically what we found is the movie kind of wound up roughly where it wanted to be. You know, I always go back to something Damien said when we were talking about his 180-page script. He kind of figured that it would probably play about a minute a page. And so his original prediction ended up being right.
180-page script. It's 3 hours and I think 7 minutes is the final runtime.
Yeah, with credits.
The movie moves really well. Something that really made a difference was the way you structured it. It almost feels like a series of vignettes,
right,
as opposed to your standard 3-act structure movie.
Right.
So I'm just curious, is there, in your mind, an actual act structure?
Yeah, I think there is definitely kind of a structure. I mean, I think I always thought of it in terms of reaching certain big milestones in characters in their arcs. I have to just point to the biggest sort of turning point, which really was when Manny, played by Diego Calva, goes to see the jazz singer and experiences this momentous thing. And everything that follows is this shift. You know, that's where you start to see the transformation. That's where you start to see all the characters change and they start to go, you know, some of them go up, they rise, and then it's kind of the descent. So, I mean, that was a big milestone. I mean, I think another thing that Damien was really adamant about was that even though he wanted to tell a story with all these characters, which I think would necessitate just a large movie in scope, he did not want it to feel meditative, you know? I mean, his directive, I think, to all the department heads, to me, and especially Justin Hurwitz, the composer, was this should feel loud. This should be explosive. This should be frenetic. We should feel the coked up energy. We should feel the adrenaline of Hollywood. So this was not going to be a rendering of a 180-page script that was going to be meditative. Even though it was kind of big in size, he wanted it to have a certain movement. And really, that's where Justin Hurwitz's music comes in. And Damien and I have a very specific way of working with Justin, the way we worked with him in the past. I mean, his music played, I think, an even bigger part. I mean, strangely, I'm about to mention La La Land, but I mean, it played such a big part in Babylon. I was going to say more so, but maybe not more so, but just as much in a way, because I think Damien wanted to have this movie be very maximalist. That is to say, he wanted to throw everything in there. It's like everything in the kitchen sink. And so with all these different elements, obviously you potentially get chaos. I think we just had to find a way to tame the chaos a little bit so that it would still feel like chaos. It would still feel reckless, but at the same time, we had to be able to kind of control it. And that's where I keep thinking of Justin Hurwitz and his music, because I really feel like Justin's music kind of was the thing that not only glued all those chaotic elements together, but also gave us the rhythm and gave us the percussiveness to kind of cut against and bounce off of.
Considering how crucial that is, what is your process for working with Justin? Is it more integrated than it might be on, tricky to compare films, but say like No Time to Die?
Sure. I mean, definitely very different in process with the way Justin and Damien work. They start working and collaborating on melodies and score ideas way before pre-production. I can't remember exactly when I heard Justin started, but he started way in advance, maybe a short time after First Man, when it became more and more of a real thing that Damien wanted to try to do. But they work out, it's the two of them. They work out melodies and sounds. And by the time Damien starts shooting, we have rough demos of Justin's score. And so I usually, me and my crew start when they start shooting. And so as soon as I get dailies, I already have Justin's music. That's one of the first things that we bring into the Avid is Justin's digital demos. And so I'm not temping with anything other than Justin's music. And it isn't just Justin's music, it's Justin's music made specifically for Babylon already. So some of these scenes, for some sequences, I have these rough animatics that Damien's kind of mocked up, and it has some of Justin's music embedded in there. And so I will use that as a reference to kind of start putting things together based on that. So by the time Damien comes in to work with me, when we're cutting picture, we're working with Justin's score. I'm music editing the score. And this is the part where the unusual process continues, which is I then send it to Justin, who is in a room next door to my cutting room. And he's there from day one when Damien's there. So I'll send him new picture, and then Justin will adjust. He'll finesse the music edits the way that he wants to do it. He'll rearrange and recompose to match what I've done. Then he'll do his own improvements and send that back. And then invariably, me and Damien have to adjust our picture. And we kind of have this rinse repeat cycle that we do with Justin. And that's not something that I do on other movies. I mean, it's not very common. I mean, in the case of Bond, one of the first things we did was the assistants loaded all the soundtracks to all the Eon production James Bond movies. And we temp with that, which sounds pretty logical, And we work with a music editor who adjusts those things, and we add other scores from other movies. I mean, that's kind of what you do normally. And often when I'm cutting stuff like something like Bond, I might be cutting things silently, especially if it's action. I cut it silent to get the rhythm, just the pictorial rhythm, and then you put the music after. Since we had the music on Babylon, we had it already, it really made sense to cut the picture to the music because we actually had the music. So in that way, our process was kind of unique to the movie, unique to Damien and Justin. And it's not something that I do on other movies, but with the way, we already have Justin's score, it makes a lot of sense to do it the way we did it.
With that level of integration, does that accelerate the process, or is it the kind of thing where it's still going to take the same amount of time? We just go through more iterations, we check more things, we explore more avenues.
It cuts both ways because it is absolutely, you can reach a place of more precision faster. You can be more exacting because you have kind of a digital demo version of what the music will be. So you don't get that usual letdown when you've temped with Sicario for 5 months and then all of a sudden you give it to your poor composer and then they have to give you something and it never lives up to it. But Damien and Justin are such musical perfectionists that it often will make for more round trips between Justin and between me and my Avid and stuff. And it just became very intensive. And because it is a music-driven film, it was intensive for every single section that had music, which was a lot of the movie. So it sped up things, but then it could be very time-consuming.
Well, in addition to working with Justin once again in this tight-knit crew, you're paired with DP Linus Sandgren.
Yes.
Which it was fascinating to me to look back at your collaborative credits because it isn't all about Damien. You did La La Land together, but then he was also on Joy and No Time to Die in addition to First Man.
Yeah. Linus and I worked together on David O. Russell's movie before he started working with Damien. So we did that one together first. And then, of course, we joined forces with Damien for La La Land, and that was his first one. I was returning from Whiplash. And then Linus and I went to London. We were together on Bond, which was a pretty wonderful thing. It was great to have a collaborator ally, someone I'd worked with there before. I mean, it's not that I'm on set working closely with them at all, but we know each other well enough that we could have a shorthand about things. But I do remember us, toward the end of it, we were always sort of whenever we'd bump into each other or see each other, we'd be talking about, did you get the latest draft of Babylon? We'd be talking about like, oh yeah, the Babylon. So that's something that another thing that I knew that would be fun to sort of cut would be Linus's amazing photography. There's a lot of great sort of storytelling with moving camera, especially in the beginning, the beginning opening party, which Linus and Damien designed to look like a oneer. There's some stitches in it. I'm talking about a shot when we pan down, we move down from a balcony during the party and we move through the crowd. And at some point we crane up and we see a wide of this party room with huge balloons in the room and almost like, Mardi Gras, like heads. And then it moves in on Sidney and the trumpet. Well, there's some stitches in there that they had always intended. And then Damien and I, when we started cutting, we added some more. We kind of went in and out of different takes, and there was some dialogue at a certain point we wanted to lift out. So there's some other digital sort of stitches in there. But what was fun is I knew that opening would have a lot of certain, I don't want to say longer takes because none of them are that long, not long, like as long as La La Land, but it would have some moving oneers that you would want to honor. And then, Damien really wanted to punctuate those things with very particular ins and outs. And so he, of course, as Damien does, shoots a ton of details and inserts, more than any other filmmaker I've worked with. He has a love of insert photography and how to use it. And so he had these shots of the record on the Victrola that he knew might be useful for us to, that's something we figured out in the cutting room just to throw us into that party room, or, the close-up of the straw snorting Coke. I mean, these are all elements, some of which he always knew would be a great way to get in the scene. Other times he was just grabbing things that he thought might be useful as building blocks. And then, of course, they were. But that also meant, similar to First Man and other movies, First Man in particular, that my crew had to really take great care and as they always do so brilliantly, just like figuring out a way to organize bins with all of the insert photography, so sorting the inserts by type, or in some cases, in addition, also sorting it by scene, and et cetera, et cetera. But I think with Damien, because he usually shoots a lot, and he shoots a lot of different pieces, there's always a lot of organizing to do. That's something I'm very reliant on in terms of how my crew sets it up.
Well, as a testament to your great intuition, the reason I brought up Linus was to get to that oneer in the party. Seeing something like that, when you see in the script or in the notes that there's going to be this big oneer through this very elaborate party, do you look at that like a little break from the editorial creative decisions there, or do you look at it like, oh shit, I got a lot of hidden stitches I got to make and a lot of sleight of hand that I got to do?
Well, I think when I realized that there's going to be something like that, because it's Damien and he is such a perfectionist, out of the gate, I know that it's going to be easy and fun because basically I just kind of cut the slates off and try to line it up. But I do this knowing that when Damien comes in, we're going to be really scrutinizing it. And if past is prologue, then I know that we're going to be stitching and mixing and matching. And of course, we did. And when you find a way to do that, that's really fun. It can be really difficult. I mean, we had some hard ones on La La Land, some real tricky ones. On this, there were some challenges, but once you unlock it, once you figure out, oh, if we put the stitch in this particular place or we do this, then it's pretty joyous. And pretty soon you forget you did it. And then you're watching it and someone talks about it and you're like, oh yeah, that's right. Oh, we did that thing. I mean, I actually have a hard time remembering. But, we're also like our VFX editor, Mike Norier, would always do an amazing job of mocking these things up and temping. So I would send it whenever we had anything like that. I would send it to him, and his temps and stuff are so good that he would make it easy for me to forget that we had done it. And even Damien would forget. Oh, that's right. It's a different thing. It's a different piece or something.
Well, something along the line of oneers. There are two different instances, maybe more if I forgot some, where there are whip pans back and forth between characters talking.
Yes.
One at the party when, there's one at the party. I don't want to give away anything about the movie. There's one at the party when they have a crisis to deal with. And then in the next segment of the film where they're on location, they're in a little crisis about they need a camera.
Yes.
The cameras are broken. We're out of cameras. We're running. Yes. Magic hour is about to evaporate. We need a camera.
Right.
So there's these whip pans that take place in those scenes.
Yes. What's
the reasoning behind why you would choose to do that? Not necessarily you as the editor, but why as storytellers you would do that?
Yeah. I mean, there's a certain, I think in those instances you're talking about, one is at the party in the back room where you're right. There's a problem and there's a sense of, I don't know how much we can give away, but it's guys talking about trying to problem solve. And there's an urgency to it because someone's life hangs in the balance. And not only someone's life, but more importantly, they have to figure out how this doesn't create bad publicity. So that was something where, if I recall, the coverage, I think Damien always intended to whip pan most of it. But I think there was some coverage that they shot without the whips so that we can mix and match if we wanted to. But, Damien, for that moment, really wanted an urgency to it. And so urgency, whip pans, it felt like it had the right sort of verve. It felt like it had the right kind of caffeinated feel, because that whole party is really, with the exception of a couple little, like I would say a lyrical moment of Nellie and Manny when they're first walking and talking. I mean, for the most part, it's all about Jack Conrad barreling through the door and people swarming him like flies. I mean, it's all very supposed to be explosive and supposed to be kind of coked up. And so I think really Damien wanted to kind of keep that going. So it wasn't just a bunch of actors standing and talking, which is what it was, but he wanted you to feel this urgency. So we really tried to lean into kind of the whips. And of course, when you do the whips, those are relatively easy places for you to put stitches in so we can mix and match takes, which we definitely did. And then the other part you're talking about is the camera. When Spike Jonze, as the director, yells cut because the horses have trampled their last camera and they have to figure out how to get another camera that's, how many hours away. The drive is how many hours away to the camera rental shop. And so there's urgency there. And so when the crew is discussing, what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? The sun is going down. I mean, I think Damien, again, wary of just having a bunch of guys standing around static talking, wanted the energy in this manic thing to continue. And that's where we could start swapping in the best pieces, because the whips allowed us moments where we could cut in. I mean, there were other moments that had whips designed that we did not use. I mean, one section that comes in mind is there was a part in Nellie's first sound take where we had a whole little section where it was whipping between the sound guy up in the booth to Ruth, the director, down below, and Nellie. Like, it was kind of whipping all over the place. Ultimately, we decided that wasn't the type of urgency we needed. I mean, we needed a different type of urgency, but the whole involved exchange didn't feel like it was in the language of that scene, because in that scene, we tried to set up a new language. We tried to reset the audience. So that's an instance where he shot it, but we didn't use it, not in the way that it was originally intended.
Well, I want to explore that a little bit more, if you don't mind, because it's tough to call that my favorite sequence of the film.
Yeah.
It certainly, for me, was the funniest.
That says a lot, because a character died by the end.
Well, that says a lot about the movie. But just to set it up for people, I mean, the film sort of tracks the evolution from silent film era to talkies and the challenges that filmmakers and actors faced in making that transition. And in this scene, they're doing their first soundstage shoot.
Yeah.
Having to worry about sound and having to worry about getting everybody on their mark correctly. And so I really love that scene. And one of the reasons I loved it was the actor is going through multiple takes. So there's a lot of repetition. So you're having to introduce repetition while keeping it upbeat and not redundant, and making sure that the audience clocks the passage of time between these things, and then building it to a frenetic pace where there's just this big climactic ending.
Right.
So it was a really fantastic bit of editing there throughout the whole film, but really in that instance. And I'd just like to know more about your experience doing that, as well as the phrase you used, using a new language, visual language with the audience.
Yeah. Well, that sequence was one that Damien and producer Matt Pluff always referred to as the whiplash sequence because it reminded them of the rushing and dragging scene from Whiplash. And so, when I started getting the dailies, it was exciting knowing that we were aspiring to get to a certain place, that Damien had a concept for it that was really exciting. But then it was also very scary because we just had a lot of pieces. And Damien, he's always very meticulous in his planning, his storyboarding, and he draws storyboards himself, stick figures, but they're very precise in that they really contain the essence of what he's going to shoot. And you really get intention by looking at his rough drawings. So as meticulous as he is in gathering and having a plan, because it's Damien, he's not going to stop until he has his version of perfection. It can be very daunting to just get into. The only comparison I can make is it's like he's pointing to the peak of the highest mountain and saying, this is so great, we're going to get to there. And you're like, oh, wow, that's really far away. I have no doubt we're going to get there, but wow. So, I would say that Whiplash was a great thing to be reminded of because you're kind of doing something similar in that you're making a big deal out of nothing in a way. Like in the case of what I mean by that is in Whiplash, the challenge was how do you take band practice and make it feel like a war movie? So in the case of Babylon, it's like, how do you take silence and, the notion of a pin dropping, this minutia, how do you amplify that to feel like life and death? It's not James Bond. We don't have Aston Martins. We don't have machine gun toting Spectre agents. So how do you make needles on an audio meter, going into the red? How do you make that feel like life and death? And so Damien's concept for that was, again, very similar to Whiplash. Create like a language, a rhythm with the editing and repeat it. Lean into the repetition, and we did that in Whiplash. And he really wanted to lean into it even more here. So the idea was to use some of these amazing pieces that he got, like the red light turning on, the sound of the bell, the slate boy coming in, the director's hand cueing Nellie, and then Nellie's feet walking and the door opening, and lean into creating a little preamble ahead of every take with all these little pieces. And then in doing that, it's going to give you a little bit of the texture of what it is, what goes into making a take. But it's also, you're going to start to create a rhythm. And then Damien said, let's repeat that every single take. And you repeat it, so it's a little bit of that Groundhog Day feeling. You repeat it so that the audience starts to you start to play with their expectations, They start to question, do I think I know what's going to happen? Is the take going to get flubbed? When is it going to get flubbed? And in that way, the repetition starts to create, hopefully, some discomfort. And, you start to feel a little bit ill at ease. And then each time with each take, we wanted to speed up each one of those things. And so on one hand, the audience is getting a shorthand, we're giving the audience a shorthand. They know how every take starts. So now we can be faster and faster. But each time you're going faster and faster, you're also kind of creating a momentum, and you're kind of trying to synchronize the audience to the rhythms of the movie, And the hope is that the audience gets this feeling of, oh my God, this machine is getting faster and faster, and we're marching towards something that is a bad outcome. So that was something that was, again, that's not a style that we had set up earlier in the movie. The early part of the movie, it was more, let's lean into the chaos. Let's lean into being in your face, being loud and reckless. Let's do it with the sound, with Justin's music, but let's also do it with how we get in and out of scenes, with the cutting. Let's make it fast, percussive. And then definitely by the time we get to this first sound take, that's why Damien wanted to start it with a very long fade up. From, completely quiet. We're coming from the jazz singer, which is cacophonous. And then we take the time to do this incredibly long fade in on this empty set. And that's so that we could do a reset. We could reset the audience. And once we reset the audience, then it's about, okay, how can we set up a grammar that the audience can like reset to, but that also can inform this scene and give it kind of an emotional momentum in a way.
Well, you're going to have to forgive me for getting all film school grad student on you, but the psychology of sound and of silence. I mean, something I noted in the film is, I remember this from The Last Jedi, where there's a moment in The Last Jedi where it's true silence. It's not just quiet.
Yes.
That has an effect on the audience.
Yes.
As I'm watching Babylon, there were more than once, I think you went for zero.
Yes.
No sound whatsoever.
Yeah.
You can feel that in the audience. And you talked about creating a discomfort in the audience before. It does that. Attention builds in that theater because we're not used to nothing.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, that's something that I feel like I get excited about how Damien likes to navigate those things, because he is someone who always believes in contrast, stylistic contrast. So that means that if we're doing something that he knows will be cutty and fast and has an overt style, he will like to offset it with a scene that's a oneer or something where it's much slower. He doesn't like to have his, even though I've talked about this movie being, having a certain explosiveness to it, and that was his intention, was to put you on the roller coaster. The movie contains a lot more than just that. I think he definitely wanted it to feel that way for the most part. If that's people's takeaway, that's pretty spot on. But he does want to tell his stories using contrast. And so the same goes for sound. As cacophonous and as loud as the movie gets, I think Damien believes that it's going to be that much more loud and powerful if you reset the audience at certain points and you go quiet. So one scene that comes to mind is the transition I mentioned, of course, going from the cacophonous jazz singer theatrical moment to then just black and silence, and then we fade in on this quiet soundstage. But also when Nellie goes, she plays that extra part in the silent film Maids Off, and she sort of bribes her way into the movie theater to watch herself. And there we just lean into, at first, pure silence. And that's something that we talked a lot about, because I think we both, we talked about how in reality, if she's going in to watch a silent film, there'd be an accompaniment, someone on a piano or a Wurlitzer or something like that. And so in a way, it wasn't realistic. And we had our music editor, Jason Reuter, line up some possible choices to tempt with. But we never felt it was really, we never found anything right. And we very quickly decided, no, it's more powerful if we're just pure silence. And it also made a lot of sense because a big part of our movie also is told through a lot of montages, musical montages, where the picture's braided with Justin's score. Well, we were just coming from a montage of Nellie's movie being completed, going through post-production, being put in the dyes, having the title card shot and all this stuff, all the way to her bribing her way into the theater. So that's all like this Justin musical roller coaster. And then after she leaves the theater, we jump right into another musical roller coaster and another montage. And so the idea of having nonstop music really felt like we needed to give the audience a break. And that was another big reason where we thought, okay, not only is it more powerful just having it be silent until you start hearing the cheers from the audience, but it also just makes sense in terms of like giving the audience a little breath between these two big montage pieces.
In a film that's a love letter to cinema, there's one memorable scene where Jack Conrad, Brad Pitt's character, they're doing an edit. He says, yeah, just take 2 frames off the head and 3 frames off the tail and we're good.
Right.
I'm sure in your relationship with Damien, it's nothing like that. But in your career, you ever deal with a situation like that where, a director is just like, oh, it's simple. Just take 2 frames here and 3 frames there and you're done.
Well, yeah. I mean, all the time. I mean, whether it's the director, producers, actors, we're often asked to like make huge moves, just move this continent over to this other part of the world, but then it also comes down to like, oh, it's so perfect. It's almost perfect. Just if we can just get 1 frame, oh yeah, it's better, and then sometimes you can tell the difference, sometimes you can't. So I really love all the little inserts Damien shot. I always laugh at that scene because I remember choosing those moments in the selects with the film sort of being pulled by and the grease pencil marking it. It basically doesn't make any sense, like the if you've really cut on film, like what's being done, what's being executed is not exactly how you would do it, but it just made sense rhythmically. It cut together well. And so again, that's why Damien does these things. I feel like when Damien does inserts, it really is about reveling in the texture of the equipment. And, in the case of Whiplash, it's like really fall in love with this drum kit or the snare being tightened, the drum key. It's all shot very beautifully, But then it isn't about just giving full render to this world that you're creating, but it's also these end up being building blocks that Damien invariably wants to use to create rhythm, And so I think of like all the camera stuff during the battlefield sequence or the parallel cut between Brad Pitt up on the mountaintop and Nellie with the tear going down. All these camera bits, all these little close-ups of film going through sprockets and all this stuff. It really reminds you that art is being rendered in a mechanical fashion, photochemical, yes, but mechanical fashion. But then it also, it's fun. It's, as an editor, it's fun because I get these pieces that I can use to like create a rhythm, or to punctuate something. And as an editor, I don't often get a chance to do that. I guess I do because I do these Damien movies, but otherwise, it's to work so stylistically and overtly can be a lot of fun, and I'm lucky to be able to do it.
Well, we started off our discussion thematically talking about the immortality of cinema.
Yeah.
The film is quite raucous throughout, visually and sonically, but really the crux of the film, to me, the axle that the film turns on is a speech that Gene Smart's character gives to Brad Pitt, talking about the immortality of cinema.
Yeah.
And the fact that you will live on through your work. And that is a very basic dialogue-driven scene. After spending so much time cutting these high-energy kinetic scenes, going back to your drum analogy, editors are often noticed for very cutty sequences.
Yeah.
And people overlook the challenge of a very simple scene like that. And I know it's very difficult to compare the two things, but if you could, just the challenge of cutting something where there is not a lot of, I don't want to say tricks up your sleeve, but everything is laid bare there for the audience.
That's right. Yeah. It's again, Damien and his appreciation of contrast and different moods and styles. And I always feel lucky to get scenes like the scene you're talking about, a dialogue scene between Gene Smart and Brad Pitt. And it's interesting because that's one that I remember when we would have friends and family screenings, a lot of people would single that one out for the performances and stuff like that. And the way I look at the movie is it's a gift to me as an editor in terms of it's full of brilliant performances. I mean, yes, that scene is very notable for its performances, but the whole movie has, Margot and Diego and everyone in the movie is just spectacular. But I guess part of it is that their performances are playing in concert with very highly stylized, high energy, high octane visual stuff. So there's a way in which you could almost forget it, maybe not forget it, but you think of the style over the performance. But it's always, it's all there throughout the movie. And as an editor, I'm lucky to have that. But I guess it's funny, it is more bare bones in that scene you're talking about. And I love cutting a scene like that because I just enjoy actors' performances. I enjoy eyes meeting eyes or not meeting eyes. I enjoy playing around with that, playing with the rhythm of that. And of course, when it's Damien, he is such a brilliant screenwriter, that his dialogue is just so powerful and so beautiful. And by the way, he is not one to be precious about anything once we get into the cutting room. So he's not precious about that. But that's another gift to me as an editor, like, wow, I've got an amazing script. I've got amazing dialogue. And now it's about cutting these things together. In a way, it's easy or made easier because you've got Brad Pitt and Gene Smart and they're so good at what they do. But then the challenge is also that because the style of it is supposed to be traditional, that is to say, it's supposed to be invisible. You don't want the editing to be noticeable. You want to play it classical and get out of the way. It also just means that, I guess to your point, you're not allowed tricks. maybe there are tricks. There are always tricks up our sleeves, right? As editors, cheating and stuff like that. But you're not supposed to see them. So you're a little bit more, it's a different type of tightrope that you're walking, because you want to really maintain this illusion that you're not doing anything at all. You want to maintain the illusion that you're not even cutting in a lot of those scenes. You just want it to feel like it's just the actors, and that this is just how it spilled out in the moment. And I don't remember doing anything too crazy. I mean, I didn't have to in that scene. It really was about, how do you want to play this moment? Who do you want to be on? And, do you want Brad to look at Gene? Do you want his eyes to look up at that moment or not? It's stuff like that. Damien often has, in his movies, I think of La La Land, I think of Whiplash, there are moments where it is just two people, like a meeting of the minds. What comes to mind is the breakup scene in La La Land, where Emma Stone and Ryan Gosling are having dinner, and a record's playing in the background. And basically, by the end of the dinner, they've broken up. But that's just a scene it's just simple coverage back and forth, But in a way, Damien wants those scenes to have, he considers them their own sort of set pieces, Maybe Gene Smart and Brad Pitt are not on the battlefield, but the scene should have the same amount of weight, emotional weight, as one of those more epic battlefield scenes.
Last week, I talked to editor Brad Wilhite about his movie Spirited. And, it was his first musical. And I said, how did you tackle this being your first musical? And he said, well, one thing I did was called Tom Cross.
It's awesome.
The fact that we have you here now, I'm just going to let you hear a little snippet of this.
I love it.
Do you remember anything that Tom Cross, Mr. La La Land, Mr. Whiplash, what did he say to you about, well, Brad, you got to make sure you do this?
Well, one thing he did is set up your bins in little sequences. If you have this musical number and it's 6 minutes long, you're going to have millions of footage, right? And he was set them up in little wins. So you cut this first, and the musicals are they have little basic structures that you can set up is sub scenes kind of, and you can edit those and keep the bins relatively manageable. And I did that and enjoyed that, because you could cut a bit of the musical number and still feel like you've accomplished something for the day, even though you had the rest of the scene to cut. I thought that was a really helpful thing. He was also a big fan of supergroups, but the assistants were always being challenged because we were editing the song on the set a lot. So it would get really tricky and almost mind-numbingly hard to do supergroups to where you didn't have big chunks of black in them. And I was finding those were a bit overwhelming.
So I couldn't pass up the chance to go right to the source and have you elaborate on your advice to Brad about both setting up the bins for a musical and also doing supergroups.
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember my specific our specific conversations, although you just played part of it there, but about setting up the bins. I mean, I think with anything, whether it's Babylon or Bond, I mean, everything seems really daunting at first. When I get all the footage, it's like, how much footage do we have? Oh, it's 3 hours of dailies or 6 hours of dailies or whatever. It's really daunting. As any editor will tell you, it's overwhelming. But the trick is to just dive in to start. And once you really, if you can, make it into manageable bites. If you're editing a big battle scene, like in the case of Babylon, it's like that whole parallel cut between the race to the camera rental shop and Nellie's dance on top of the bar. That whole thing was just so daunting at first. And Damien had pre-planned it with animatics, storyboards and stuff. But even still, there's so many different pieces and elements. But if you can get a handle on it, take it bite by bite, if you can get a feel for the totality of the material, let's look at all of just Ruth, the director, and her AD. All right, I've seen everything. Now I have a feel for that. Okay, I get it. I've got that. Check that off. Now let me look at all of Nellie's stuff. So it's like when you understand the totality of it, then I find it less daunting, because then I know that there's an end to the footage and end to the options. I mean, there may still be how many millions of options, but it's not limitless. I think when you see a pile of film, it feels like it's endless, But in the case of supergroups, I do favor the supergroup approach. And something that I really started to do on Whiplash was, I think initially I had done when I was back in my assistant days, when I worked with John Axelrad on Scott Cooper's movie Crazy Heart. John was the one who said, I want to do it this way, which was a supergroup. Take all the musical footage, which is shot to a pre-record. So every single take of that musical number has the same, basically this identical song track, because the actor is singing on top of himself or herself to a pre-recorded track. So every take has a common thread. And the idea is to sort of make a group of all of those takes, all the coverage. And that's what we did on Crazy Heart, is we would put it into one group. And then when you cut it into the timeline, this group, this monster group, all you have to do is make add edits and swap the camera, and you're looking through all of the coverage, and it's in sync with the music in the timeline. So you're never having to find sync. It's already in sync when you switch to a different angle. I cut an indie movie called Any Day Now with Alan Cumming, and he is a nightclub singer. And so I use that same method, would create a super group. The difference with Whiplash, I found, was that there was so much coverage for these scenes, especially the end, that it was necessary to create several super groups in order to make it manageable. Because the problem with creating a group, a super group, is that how do you sort it and how do you know where to find something? It can be overwhelming because you could have hundreds of shots all in this one group. So what we started doing on Whiplash, we being me and my crew of assistants, is we started organizing it based on what I would find when I would just take a cursory look through the footage. And then I would draw, like on a legal pad, I just list setups and say, you know what, let's put these setups in this group. This will be a super group, and call it supergroup band. Okay, now this will be supergroup John Legend, or this will be supergroup, Ryan Gosling or whatever, names of the characters. And it would go like that. And we kind of did that for Babylon with a lot of numbers, where we would group things and say, okay, this is all Nelly on the bar. Now this is this other thing. I can't remember exactly, but we did use it. And I find that that's really helpful to be able to like access things, to have it there. Because I think one, and again, I say this knowing that there are different ways of working, and there have been great movies that have done things differently. I know this because I've talked to other editors about how they do things and their approach. And a lot of us work differently, but it still works, But I tend to favor kind of the supergroup method for musical scenes. But I feel Brad's pain, because that is a thing when songs are, the pre-record is changed on set, which makes it hard to kind of figure out how to put something, how do you organize it? But I find supergroup, and I will say also that we continued using the Avid script. Philip Trujillo, one of our assistant editors, sort of specializes in that for me, and I love having him on every show, and he organizes my Avid script. And there we find other ways to organize it too. We're often putting extra detail into that script in order to find not just dialogue, but action and beats and stuff like that. So it's pretty intensive, but we do it at the beginning of the show so that when Damien comes in, I know where to find everything, and it's really helpful.
In most of these interviews that I do, I struggle to get to all the questions. When you factor in someone like yourself, whose work I admire a great deal, and also just the nature of the film Babylon, there was no way we were going to get to all these questions. We might have to do a Babylon Part 2 someday.
Yeah. I
think we'll close on one of the questions that the film asks. So Tom Cross, toppings on ice cream, where do you stand?
I'm a fan of the, I don't know how Nelly and Manny would feel, but I'm a fan of hard shell, the chocolate hard shell on the ice cream. I find that irresistible. But you know what? I'm going to be the great equivocator here. I'm going to say, I don't mind ice cream without it too. So it goes both ways. I like to have my cake and eat it too.
Diplomatic. That's what an editor does.
That's right. You go with the flow.
You certainly do. Who goes with the flow in the cutting room better than Tom Cross? He never rushes, he never drags. He always takes the material he's given and finds a way to elevate it. Babylon is an epic movie, and Tom's talents are on full display throughout. And of course, talking to him is always an education, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Say, not many days left in this year of 2022. So close it out right by treating yourself or the editor you love with the gift of Avid Media Composer, Tom Cross's cutting room weapon of choice. Great holiday season deals going on right now for both Media Composer and Pro Tools. So click that little link in the show notes and it will take you right to the special offers page on avid.com. Okay, time to put a bow on this podcast. It's all wrapped up. If I haven't said it before, I'll say it now. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your feedback. And of course, thank you for all your support. Until we meet again, this is Matt Fury, and I will see you right back here next time on The Rough Cut.